It's the Jim and Terry Show, the Terry less Jim show, the Terry without Jim. Does it Terry less? Doesn't that sound like without Terry? Anyway, it is without Jim in the hot seat again this morning. No one to banter with, no one to disagree with or agree with, no one to commiserate with, no one to wax eloquent with, just my own thoughts. What am I thinking on this fine day? Well, having just finished listening to a podcast this morning by the, what is it called? The Daily Eager Beaver podcast. You can look it up on YouTube. This article was referenced, and I thought I would check it out. And the article is published in a website called medium.com, which seems to be just a generic, you can post things there if you feel akin to or similarly inclined with the spirit of the website, which seems to be just, treat each other nicely, don't stir the pot, no personal attacks, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, that's the site. I'll put it in the link below. The title is called Unmasking Pierre Poilievre, The Demagogue's Playbook and the Dangers for Canada, by a writer who sounds interesting, but I can't find very much about him except that he's penned a few articles. And this one is one in the political vein, so it's a political analysis. J.D. Blackburn. And if I'm not mistaken, he writes, this one is in English, but I think his original is going to be en français. His moniker at the back, at the bottom of his article, is called Jackie Dallaire. So I wonder if that's J.D. Blackburn. And since he writes his little brief biography en français, I'm assuming that this was translated or he wrote it. He's bilingual and wrote it in English. Anyway, I found it very interesting. So I'm going to go over a couple of key things because you may not be thinking what this fellow is presenting. And I'm going to start with his proposition at the beginning. He introduces his article with this paragraph. Quote, I want to start this article with an important clarification. I am not affiliated with any political party and consider myself to be a political orphan. I am neither liberal nor conservative, but rather a centrist who believes in contextual politics. Sometimes, in some situations, I believe that left-wing policies would be better, while in other contexts, I lean to the right. I have strongly criticized the current Trudeau government for its communication management during the pandemic, but the current speeches and messages delivered by the opposition leader, Pierre Poilievre, terrify me, and that's why I want to share this message with the public. That's the opening paragraph, and that got me interested. So here's a centrist, which is where I think most Canadians, if we follow the bell curve, most of us are centrists, either slightly in advance of the curve, slightly to the left, slightly behind the curve, slightly to the right. But this is what I think most Canadians would be. So I was interested to hear his voice. And the line that kind of tweaked my radar was, I've criticized Trudeau, but the messages delivered by current speeches and rallies of Pierre Poilievre terrify me. And that's what I want to see. What evidence does he present to paint this picture of being terrified of the fellow who spent 20 years in the House of Commons right out of college and has no work experience, blah, 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 whatever it is? What's your criticism of Pierre Poilievre? He went from geeky nerd with glasses and slicked hair to a rather muscular-looking physique with a black or white t-shirt. Is that to show the abs, the pecs, to show the guns? I'm not sure. The guns could be literal or metaphorical, and I'll get to a recent ad that Pierre Poilievre's campaign put out, but it was pulled over the weekend. So it's what you called ratioed. And I never knew what this term really meant, but it means when the backlash against a posting receives more attention and goes viral more than the ad itself. That's called ratioed. I didn't know that. Call me old school. I'm learning something new every day, and I enjoy that. The article goes on with this beginning. In recent years, political figures using demagoguery to gain power have become increasingly common. In Canada, Pierre Poilievre is one such example. This article breaks down his psychological and political tactics, showing how he uses them and explaining why they are dangerous for our society. We will draw parallels with Donald Trump and the MAGA movement in the United States, as well as with the QAnon cult, a fertile ground for conspiracy theories that are also gaining traction in our country. And below that appears a black and white, looks like a photograph of Pierre Poilievre with glasses, with slicked hair, perhaps looking like it's from the House of Commons, but it's highly stylized. And it is rather ominous looking, so let's see what he says. He begins by introducing a definition, and I always like to define the terms before you start criticizing something. What is a demagogue? Quote, a demagogue is someone who seeks popular support by exploiting passions, fears, prejudices, and emotions of the general public rather than using rational or logical arguments, or I would say policies. Here are some characteristics of the demagogue, and he has 5 major points. Exploiting statistics by distorting correlations disguised as causalities. Remember, things happening at the same time, and I often say this about theology, correlation is not causality. 2 things can be happening and they are not causally related. One did not lead to the other. So that's an important thing. You distort correlations. Promoting conspiracy theories whenever necessary or whenever one chooses to, what? Stoke the base. Okay. Undermining public trust in institutions. Of course, talking about universities, talking about government policies, undermining the legal institutions, the Supreme Court of Canada, the rulings by the courts. Polarizing society through rhetoric, that means just the language that you use to stir the pot. And finally, attacking opponents with personal insults, portraying them as enemies of the people, and dehumanizing anyone who opposes you. Well, that sort of fits the bill, in my estimation, very well articulated. Exploiting emotions. He goes on to look at the psychological tactics. And when he says exploiting emotions, he gives some examples. Emotional appeals are powerful because they bypass people's rational analysis and go straight to what people are feeling, straight to their heart. Fear, as we know, is one of the most powerful motivators for action. For example, Poilievre constantly paints a picture of a country besieged by external or internal threats to rally support from his base. If you find yourself feeling the sense of urgency and fear after one of his speeches, you've fallen into his trap. Simplifying complex issues. Well, you've heard me often talk about Pierre's 3-word slogans. You can't sloganize your way into the Prime Minister's office. Or can you? We'll see in the election coming up. Quote, for a demagogue and his base, complex political issues are often reduced to a simple binary choice. This tactic is known as a false dilemma. It allows people to form an opinion without fully understanding all the complexities. Pierre Poilievre is an expert at using this method to frame all debates in a way that supports his agenda. For instance, economic policies might be presented as either supporting hardworking Canadians or aiding corrupt elites, without allowing room for discussion of the more complex economic realities. This oversimplification of complex problems often finds fertile ground among less educated populations or those lacking the perspective to critically think through these issues. And I would add another one. Those without the time, which is what Jim and I have as retired guys, the time to check into this stuff. Now, I'll go one step further and say the curiosity. I don't think Jim is curious about a lot of these things. He's very curious about other things. But what this fellow JD Blackburn is saying here is stuff I am very curious about. So this is speaking to my curiosity and saying, to what extent do I agree with this? And let's go on. Conspiracy theories and misleading correlations. Poilievre is known for spreading conspiracy theories and presenting correlations as causalities. Well, we've already done with that. The misleading representation simplifies the narrative and directs public anger. Sometimes he might even not just point the finger, but encourage anger towards the Canadian government, which he labels as solely responsible for all the problems afflicting all Canadians. You can tell when people use broad strokes, the great generalizations, that they have very little detail to explain their position. Where there is no detail, you can bet that it's all concoction. It's been made up, it's been faked, it's been stoked, and that's what the Conservatives are doing when they peddle conspiracy theories. Undermining trust in institutions, well, we've already talked about his attack on people who are in charge of various branches of the government. Poilievre seeks to erode public trust. This tactic, unfortunately, is used by people who are called autocrats. Since the beginning of time immemorial, it is dangerous because it undermines the pillars of democracy, creates a vacuum that he positions himself alone to fill. When I'm Prime Minister, this is going to happen. When I'm in charge, I will do this. When the trust in institutions diminishes, people are more likely to turn to a charismatic leader who claims to have all the answers. The danger? It's a risk to all of us. Our rights will be eroded. Our taxes will not be hacked and slashed, well, without a cost anyway. Yeah, you can lower taxes, but you will reduce services. And I don't know about you, but I'm already waiting in line in the ER, already waiting in line for medical services, already waiting in line for all kinds of things that used to make up what we would have called Canada. Canada. Is it the land of Pierre Poilievre's vision? I'll get on to his recent ad on Twitter, which he deleted. Nothing speaks confidence like deleting your ad. Bye-bye for now.